There exists a symbol that has crossed millennia, carved in stone, painted in stained glass, whispered in secret prayers. A symbol that kings feared, that the church watched with suspicious eyes, but that the people never stopped venerating. That symbol is the rose. But why would a simple flower carry so much power? Why were entire cathedrals built around giant rose windows? Why did medieval monks draw roses in the corners of forbidden manuscripts? And why, when someone wanted to keep an absolute secret, did they say it was sub rosa, under the rose? The truth is that the rose was never just a flower. It was a code, a language, a spiritual map left by someone that history tried to erase, but that human memory refused to forget. Today you're going to discover something that was deliberately silenced, something that connects Mary Magdalene, the first Christians, the texts that were banned from the Bible, and a tradition of mystical love that survived in the shadows. This isn't fantasy. This isn't invention. These are historical fragments, real manuscripts, symbols that still adorn ancient churches, pieces of a puzzle that, when united, reveal a profound message. And this message wasn't made for priests or theologians. It was made for people like you and me, for those who seek something beyond ready-made answers, for those who feel there are layers of truth waiting to be discovered. The rose you'll see carved in Gothic cathedrals isn't there by chance. It's the signature of a hidden tradition. It's the code of a language of love that Mary Magdalene, according to certain traditions preserved throughout the centuries, would have transmitted to the first Christian communities. A language that taught that the divine isn't distant, but lives within each human heart. A language that said, you don't need intermediaries to find God. You yourself are a sacred temple. But this message was dangerous. Dangerous for power structures. Dangerous for those who wanted to control the faith of others. And therefore it was buried. The texts were hidden, the voices were silenced, and the woman who carried this wisdom was transformed for centuries into something she never was. Today we're going to unearth this language. We're going to read the symbols that survived. We're going to hear the echoes of a feminine voice that, even censored, never stopped whispering through the generations. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover could change the way you see Christianity, spirituality, and even yourself. This is the story of the Rose Codex, the secret language of love that Mary Magdalene wanted to leave to the world. If you've ever entered a Gothic cathedral, you've certainly seen those giant circular windows, with colored stained glass organized like petals. They're called rose windows, and they're not there just for beauty. Each rose window is a silent declaration of something much deeper. During the Middle Ages, when these cathedrals were erected, architects and master builders worked with hidden symbolism. Everything had meaning. The height of the naves, the arrangement of the columns, the light entering through the stained glass, everything was designed to transmit spiritual messages, and at the center of many of these cathedrals, right above the main altar, was the rose. The rose also appears in another mysterious context, the Latin expression sub rosa, which means under the rose. When something was said sub rosa, it meant it was an absolute secret. In medieval halls, it was common to hang a rose from the ceiling during confidential meetings. Whatever was spoken there could not be repeated. The rose was the seal of silence. Why would a flower be chosen to guard such deep secrets? Some historical traditions suggest that the rose represented the sacred feminine. In ancient cultures, the rose was associated with goddesses of love and wisdom, Isis in Egypt, Venus in Rome, Aphrodite in Greece. But when Christianity was established, something curious happened. The rose wasn't eliminated. It was reinterpreted. The church began to associate the rose with the Virgin Mary. Prayers like the Rosary emerged, where each bead represents a rose offered to the Mother of Jesus. But there's something intriguing about this. Scholars of religious symbolism point out that this association may have served as a way to Christianize a much older symbol, a symbol that, in primitive Christian communities, was linked to another Mary, Mary Magdalene. Gnostic manuscripts preserved since the 4th century mention Magdalene as the disciple who best understood the inner teachings of Jesus. Texts like the Gospel of Mary, discovered in 1896 in Egypt, present Magdalene as a spiritual leader, someone who taught the other disciples. And in various European mystical traditions, the rose was the symbol of this feminine wisdom. a wisdom that spoke of love but not superficial romantic love. It spoke of love as a path to knowledge, of love as a door to the divine interior. This language, this way of teaching through symbols, flowers, perfumes, gestures, was common in the ancient Middle East. Jesus himself used parables, images from nature, metaphors, and Magdalene, according to certain academic interpretations, would have developed her own symbolic language to transmit teachings that wouldn't fit in direct words. The rose, with its petals in perfect spiral, represents the journey from exterior to interior. Each layer of petals is a level of understanding. At the center of the rose is the heart, the point where the human meets the divine. The rose blooms just as the human soul blooms when it awakens to its true nature. But here comes the mystery. If this language was so precious, why was it hidden? Why isn't it in the Gospels we read today? Why was Magdalene reduced for centuries to a minor figure when ancient texts clearly describe her as one of the central figures of Jesus' movement? These questions lead us to a crucial moment in history, a moment when decisions were made about what would be preserved and what would be left out, a moment when voices were chosen to be heard and others were deliberately silenced. And it's precisely this story we need to understand to unveil the code of the rose. But before we continue, I want you to know, this journey we're taking together isn't solitary. We are thousands around the world rediscovering these truths. And if you feel this message resonates with you, if something within your heart recognizes this ancient language, then you're part of this collective awakening. Subscribe to the channel now, not as a mechanical request, but as an invitation. Because in the upcoming videos, we're going to dive even deeper. We're going to open forgotten manuscripts. We're going to analyze symbols that are hidden in plain sight. We're going to connect dots that official history left separated. And you won't want to miss any step of this revelation. Activate the bell because each video is a new piece of this millennial mosaic. Now, let's meet the woman behind the symbol. When you hear the name Mary Magdalene, what image comes to your mind? For centuries, Western tradition painted Magdalene as a repentant sinner, a prostitute who found redemption at Jesus' feet. This version of the story was repeated in sermons, represented in paintings, taught in schools. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not in the Bible. Let's look at the facts documented in the canonical Gospels. Those that are in the Bible you know. Mary Magdalene is mentioned by name in all 4 Gospels. She appears as one of the women who followed Jesus and supported him financially. In Luke 8:2-3 we read that Jesus had cast out 7 demons from her, and that after that she became one of his most devoted followers. There's no mention of prostitution. None. More importantly, Magdalene was present at the most crucial moments. She was at the foot of the cross when Jesus was crucified, a moment when, according to the Gospels, most of the male disciples had fled. She was the one who prepared the body for burial, and she was the first witness of the resurrection. In John 20:11-18, Magdalene is the one who finds the empty tomb, who converses with the risen Jesus, and who receives the order, "Go and tell the others." For this reason, some medieval theologians called her Apostola Apostolorum, the Apostle of the Apostles. So where did the image of the sinner come from? In the year 591, Pope Gregory I gave a sermon in which he mixed 3 different women mentioned in the Gospels: Mary Magdalene, the sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet, Luke 7, and Mary of Bethany. He transformed them into one person, and for almost 1,400 years, this confusion remained as official truth. It was only in 1969 that the Catholic Church officially recognized the error and separated these figures. But the damage was done. The image of Magdalene as a prostitute was already deeply rooted in culture. Why does this matter? Because this distortion wasn't accidental. It served a purpose, to diminish the role of women in primitive Christianity. If Magdalene could be transformed into a redeemed sinner, then her authority as a spiritual leader was erased. If she was just a grateful follower and not a teacher, then her voice didn't need to be heard. But what happens when we read the texts that didn't make it into the Bible? In 1945, in Egypt, manuscripts buried for more than 1,600 years were discovered. They were primitive Christian texts that had been hidden when certain groups were declared heretical. Among these texts was the Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene. In this Gospel, Magdalene appears teaching the other disciples about spiritual visions that Jesus had revealed to her. Peter questions her authority. He asks, "Did Jesus really speak with a woman in secret and not openly with us?" Levi, another disciple, defends Magdalene, saying, "If the Master considered her worthy, who are we to reject her?" The text preserves a real conflict of the first Christian communities. There was tension about feminine leadership. There were those who accepted Magdalene's role as teacher, and there were those who resisted. Another text, the Gospel of Philip, also found at Nag Hammadi, uses symbolic language to describe the closeness between Jesus and Magdalene. The manuscript is damaged, but the preserved phrase says, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Master loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her frequently," on the gap in manuscript. Scholars debate what this language means. Some interpret it as reference to a personal relationship. Others see it as spiritual metaphor. The kiss, representing the transmission of sacred knowledge, something common in ancient mystical traditions. The important thing isn't to speculate about what we don't know. The important thing is to recognize what we know. Magdalene was a central figure. She was respected, she taught, and she was, throughout the centuries, systematically diminished. But something resisted this attempt at erasure. Something survived, and that something was encoded in symbols, in roses, in perfumes, in gardens, a language that didn't need written words to be transmitted, a language that women passed to one another, from generation to generation, through popular devotions, songs, traditions that the official church didn't completely control. This is the language we're going to unveil. Imagine living in a time where your beliefs are considered dangerous, where writing openly about your faith can result in persecution. What would you do? Would you keep silent, or would you find another way to transmit your message? The primitive Christian communities faced exactly this. In the first centuries, before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Jesus' followers were frequently persecuted. They needed to gather in secret. They needed to develop codes to recognize each other. One of the best-known symbols was the fish, the ichthys in Greek, but there were others, and among them was the rose. Why the rose? Because it carried layers of meaning that could only be understood by those who had been initiated into that community. To an outside observer, it was just a flower. To those who knew how to read the code, it was a complete spiritual map. The rose, with its petals organized in spiral, followed a sacred geometry. Ancient mathematicians and mystics observed that nature used precise mathematical patterns, the golden ratio, Fibonacci spirals. These patterns appeared in shells, sunflowers, galaxies, and roses. For primitive Christian mystics, this was evidence that divine creation followed an invisible logic, a hidden order that connected all things. The rose became, then, a symbol of unity between the visible and the invisible, between the material and the spiritual, between the human and the divine. But there was another level of meaning. The rose was linked to perfume, to aromatic oil, and here we arrive at something crucial in Magdalene's story. In all the canonical Gospels, there are scenes of anointing, women anointing Jesus with perfumed oil. In some Gospels, she's identified as Mary of Bethany, in others as an anonymous woman. But popular tradition always associated these scenes with Magdalene. The oil used in these anointings was nard, an extremely expensive aromatic plant imported from the Himalayas. Judas, according to the Gospel of John, protested, saying that oil could be sold for 300 denarii, almost a year's salary for a worker, and the money given to the poor. But Jesus defended the woman, saying she had done something beautiful. Why was that gesture so significant? Because anointing with oil wasn't just an act of affection, it was a prophetic act. In the Old Testament, kings and priests were anointed with oil when they were consecrated. The word Messiah in Hebrew literally means the anointed one. Christ in Greek means the same thing. When a woman anointed Jesus, she was symbolically recognizing him as the anointed one, the chosen one. She was playing the role of priestess. And if we read carefully in the Gospel of John, Jesus himself validates this act, saying that the woman was preparing him for burial. That is, she understood what was to come. This scene carries a powerful message. Deep spiritual recognition didn't come from the official religious leaders of that time. It came from a woman. It came through a symbolic, silent, aromatic gesture. Scholars of primitive Christian spirituality suggest there was an entire tradition of teachings transmitted through gestures, symbols, and rituals not just through words, and that Magdalene, specifically, may have been the bearer of this symbolic tradition. The Gnostics, Christian groups that emphasized direct knowledge of the divine, used poetic and symbolic language in their texts. They spoke of light, of fullness, of interior gardens. And many of these texts were preserved precisely because they were hidden when they were declared heretical in the 4th century. The rose, then, represented the interior garden, the place where the soul flourishes, the point where the human touches the divine without need of hierarchies or intermediaries. This was a revolutionary message, because it meant that each person, man or woman, rich or poor, carried within themselves the capacity for direct connection with God. There was no need for grand temples or powerful priests. The temple was within each heart. But this message was dangerous for power structures that depended precisely on being the intermediaries between people and God. And that's why, when the church became institutionalized, when Christianity became the official religion of the empire, certain voices were silenced, certain texts were banned, and certain symbolic languages were reinterpreted. The rose remained, but its message was modified. Instead of representing the interior awakening of each individual, it came to represent the purity of the Virgin Mary, an unattainable, distant purity that could only be venerated, never lived. The language of the rose, which before was a path, became merely an ornament, but now you know the code. And when you see rose windows in cathedrals, when you hear about mystical roses, you'll know that there, hidden under layers of reinterpretation, is an ancient teaching. A teaching that says, you are sacred, you are the temple, you are the rose that can bloom. And now I want to know from you, when you discovered that Magdalene wasn't who they told you, what did you feel? Surprise? Indignation? Curiosity? Write in the comments your first reaction to discovering these layers of history that were hidden. Your voice matters, because this awakening isn't solitary. We are thousands, rediscovering together what was silenced. To understand why certain texts were preserved and others were banned, we need to travel to the year 325 AD, to the city of Nicaea in present-day Turkey. Until that moment, Christianity was a mosaic of diverse communities. There were Christians in Rome, in Alexandria, in Antioch, in Syria, in Armenia. Each community had its traditions, its texts, its ways of interpreting Jesus' teachings. There was debate, plurality, diversity of thought. But Emperor Constantine had a problem. He had just made Christianity legal in the empire after centuries of persecution, and now he needed unity. He needed this new official religion not to be fragmented, but cohesive. After all, religious divisions could become political divisions. So Constantine convened bishops from throughout the empire to the Council of Nicaea. The official objective was to resolve theological disputes, especially about the nature of Jesus. Was he divine from the beginning, or was he elevated to divinity? But the consequences of this council went far beyond. It was at Nicaea and in the councils that followed in subsequent decades that they began to define what would be the canon, the official list of texts that would be considered sacred scripture, and consequently which texts would be left out. The process wasn't simple. There were dozens of Gospels circulating among Christian communities, Gospels attributed to Thomas, to Philip, to Peter, to Mary Magdalene, to James. There were texts about Jesus' childhood, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, apocalyptic texts, texts of secret teachings. How was it decided which texts would enter and which would be left out? Scholars of Christianity's history point to some criteria that seem to have been applied. First, antiquity. The chosen texts should be as old as possible, ideally written by apostles or their immediate generations. Second, widespread use. Texts that were already widely read and accepted by many communities had more chance of being included. Third, theological orthodoxy. Texts that contradicted the doctrines being established as official were problematic. And here the complications begin. Because many of the Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Mary, emphasized direct interior knowledge, personal illumination, spiritual equality between men and women. These ideas conflicted with a hierarchical church structure that was forming. It's important to understand, we're not talking about a malicious conspiracy. We're talking about a complex historical process where people with different theological and political visions made decisions they considered right for the unity and survival of the faith. but the consequences were real. Texts were left out, and with them, voices were silenced. A clear example is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Why wasn't it included? Probably because it presented Magdalene in a leadership role that contradicted the growing patriarchal structure of the institutional church. If Magdalene was seen as an apostle, as a teacher of the disciples, this created a precedent for feminine leadership. But the church that was forming in the 4th century didn't want this precedent. Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the most influential bishops of that time, wrote a letter in 367 AD, listing the 27 books that should compose the New Testament. He also instructed that other texts be destroyed. And it was exactly because of these instructions that some monks in Egypt, fearing losing these texts forever, buried them in sealed jars near the city of Nag Hammadi. These jars remained hidden for more than 1,600 years until they were discovered accidentally in 1945 by a peasant. What do we find in these manuscripts? A window into a different Christianity. A Christianity where Mary Magdalene taught the disciples, where Jesus spoke about the interior light that exists in each person, where the divine feminine was honored through figures like Sophia, wisdom. It's not about saying these texts are better or worse than the canonical Gospels. It's about recognizing that there was a selection process, that choices were made, and that these choices shaped for almost 2,000 years what we consider to be Christianity. But the historical truth is that in the first centuries there were many ways of being Christian, and one of these ways profoundly honored the role of women, especially Mary Magdalene, as bearers of spiritual wisdom. When you look at rose windows in Gothic cathedrals, you're seeing an echo of this tradition, because the medieval builders, even centuries after the Council of Nicaea, still carried memories of a broader, more mystical, more symbolic Christianity. The rose survived because some teachings cannot be completely erased. They persist in symbols, in popular traditions, in devotions that the people keep alive even when institutions try to modify them. And this is what makes this story so powerful. Truth always finds a way, even if it's through stone petals carved in stained glass. Throughout all of Europe, especially in France and Spain, there are images of Mary, but not the Mary you might imagine. They are black Madonnas, sculptures and paintings of a virgin with dark skin, sometimes holding the baby Jesus, also with dark skin. The official church explains these images, saying that the wood darkened with time, or that they're representations of the bride from the Song of Songs, which says, "I am black but comely." But scholars of popular religiosity point to something deeper. The black Madonnas have been venerated for centuries in pilgrimage sites. Chartres in France has one. Montserrat in Spain has another famous one, Częstochowa in Poland. There are hundreds scattered throughout Europe, and many of them are associated with miracles, healings, apparitions. What makes these figures fascinating isn't just their color, but where they're located, frequently in sanctuaries that, before Christianity, were sites of worship to ancient goddesses, sites associated with the sacred feminine. Some academic interpretations suggest that the black Madonnas represent a continuity of veneration of the divine feminine that existed before Christianity was established in Europe. The black color, in mystical traditions, represents the earth, fertility, the mystery of life and death. It represents the dark womb from which all life emerges. But there's another layer to this story. Oral traditions preserved in some regions of France link the black Madonnas not to the Virgin Mary, mother of Jesus, but to the other Mary, Mary Magdalene. According to legends of Provence, in southern France, Magdalene would have arrived in that region in a boat, fleeing persecutions after Jesus' crucifixion. She would have lived in a grotto, taught, performed miracles. And to this day there are pilgrimages to the grotto of Saint-Baume, where Magdalene supposedly lived her last years. These traditions were preserved through popular devotions, festivals, processions, songs, and curiously, many of these sites have images of black Madonnas. Would it be coincidence? Or would it be a way to preserve under the respectable mantle of the Virgin Mary a more ancient veneration of Magdalene as a figure of feminine wisdom? The historian of religions Jacques Winen, in his studies about the black Madonnas, suggested that these images may have functioned as substitutes, allowing communities to continue honoring the sacred feminine in ways the official church would accept, while maintaining, internally, deeper meanings. This is a common characteristic in popular religions. People find ways to maintain their devotions even when they're not officially approved. Symbols are reinterpreted. Saints are associated with ancient divinities. Pagan festivals are Christianized, but maintain ancient rituals. And the rose is at the center of these devotions. In many processions dedicated to the Black Madonnas, people carry roses. In some traditions, roses are left at the feet of the images. The perfume of roses is associated with miracles and Marian apparitions, but if we look carefully at the symbolism, we'll see that the rose connects all these figures: the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, and before them, the ancient goddesses of love and wisdom. The rose is the symbol that crosses religious borders. It's universal. And perhaps it's exactly for this reason that it was chosen as code, because it could be seen without threatening, could be venerated without being questioned, could preserve ancient teachings under an accepted appearance. The Black Madonnas teach us something important. The spiritual memory of peoples is stronger than institutional decisions. What people feel in their hearts, what they see as sacred, cannot be completely controlled by decrees or councils. And when thousands of people, generation after generation, make pilgrimages to a grotto or a chapel to light candles before a Black Madonna, they're participating in something much greater than they might consciously understand. They're keeping alive a tradition of honoring the sacred feminine, of recognizing that the divine also manifests in the feminine, of seeking the wisdom that was silenced but never completely forgotten. There's a particularly interesting detail about the Black Madonna of Chartres. The Cathedral of Chartres, with its giant rose window, was built on a much more ancient sacred site. There was there a sacred well where, according to historical records, Celtic druids performed rituals before Christianity's arrival. The site was dedicated to the divine feminine. When Christianity arrived, the site wasn't destroyed. It was transformed. A church was built there. And in the basement of this church, preserved to this day, is a crypt with the Black Madonna. This suggests something profound. The medieval builders understood that there were layers of the sacred in that place, that the divine feminine had been honored there since time immemorial, and that the best way to preserve this tradition was to incorporate it, transform it, but not destroy it completely. The rose in the rose window of Chartres, therefore, isn't just an ornament. It's a declaration. Here the feminine is sacred. Here ancient wisdom is preserved. Here under the colored light that crosses the glass petals, something ancient still lives. And when you understand this, when you enter a Gothic cathedral and look up, seeing the sunlight fragment into 1,000 colors through the rose window, you're not just admiring medieval architecture, you're witnessing a spiritual code that survived the centuries. The Black Madonnas teach us that spiritual truth cannot be totally controlled. It finds cracks. It persists in popular devotions. It hides in symbols that people continue honoring even when the original meanings have been consciously forgotten. But the heart remembers. The soul recognizes. And when a woman lights a candle before a Black Madonna asking for protection, healing, or guidance, she's participating in a tradition that goes back to Mary Magdalene, and before her, to the very roots of the sacred feminine in humanity. The rose, the Black Madonna, the perfume, the colored light, all of this is part of a language that was silenced in words, but that survived in symbols. And now, let's see how this language appears in the very scriptures that were preserved. You might be wondering, if this symbolic language of the rose is so important, why isn't it explicitly in the Bible? Actually, it is, but not in the obvious way we might expect. It's encoded in gardens, perfumes, flowers, and metaphors that cross both the Old and New Testaments. Let's start with the Song of Songs, also called the Song of Solomon. This is one of the most mysterious books of the Bible. It's a poem of passionate, sensual love that celebrates the desire between a man and a woman. For centuries, theologians debated why such an erotic text would be in the sacred scriptures. The traditional interpretation is that the song represents the love between God and his people, or between Christ and the church. It's a spiritual allegory, but if we read the literal text, we find something fascinating. It's full of images of gardens, flowers, perfumes, and especially roses. I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. Song 2.1. The bride identifies herself as a rose. And the groom responds, describing her beauty through floral and aromatic images. There's mention of myrrh, incense, saffron, nard, cinnamon. The nard, the same extremely expensive oil that was used to anoint Jesus. The garden appears as a central metaphor. A garden locked is my sister, my bride, a garden locked, a fountain sealed. Song 412. The garden represents something intimate, sacred, protected, an interior space where love and the divine meet. Now observe how this language echoes in the Gospels. When Mary Magdalene goes to Jesus' tomb on Sunday morning and finds it empty, she sees someone she thinks is the gardener. John 20:15 records, Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener. Why would Magdalene confuse the risen Jesus with a gardener? Some scholars of biblical symbolism suggest this isn't a random confusion, it's a symbolic clue. Jesus, in the context of that intimate scene in the garden of the tomb, is being presented as the gardener of the restored Eden. He's the new Adam, and Magdalene, the first to recognize him, is the new Eve. Not the Eve of the fall, but the Eve of redemption. The garden again appears as a place of profound spiritual revelation. And there's more. In John 19:39-40, we read that Nicodemus brought about 100 pounds of a mixture of myrrh and aloes to prepare Jesus' body after the crucifixion. 100 pounds are approximately 33 kilograms of aromatic spices, an enormous quantity worthy of a king. But it was a woman identified by tradition as Magdalene who first anointed Jesus with perfumed nard. It was she who, through the prophetic gesture of anointing, recognized his spiritual royalty. Perfume, garden rose. All these elements form a symbolic language that crosses the scriptures. It's the language of sacred love, of profound recognition, of spiritual intimacy. The Christian mystics of the Middle Ages understood this. Saint Teresa of Avila described the soul as an interior garden that should be cultivated. Saint John of the Cross wrote about the secret garden where the soul finds the divine beloved. These weren't just poetic metaphors, they were descriptions of real mystical experiences, using the same symbolic language that was already present in the scriptures. The rose, specifically, represented the soul in bloom. Just as a rose blooms petal by petal, spiritual consciousness expands gradually, revealing increasingly deeper layers of understanding. And here's the crucial aspect of this language. It wasn't intellectual. It wasn't about memorizing doctrines or debating theology. It was experiential. It was about feeling, perfuming, contemplating. It was about using all the senses to access the sacred. When Jesus said, "Consider the lilies of the field," Matthew 6:28, he wasn't just giving advice about not worrying. He was teaching through the language of nature, a language that goes straight to the heart, not to the analytical mind. And Magdalene, according to preserved traditions, was a master of this language. She taught through gestures, perfumes, symbols. She understood that the sacred cannot be fully captured in words, but can be transmitted through sensory and symbolic experiences. That's why the rose became her symbol, because the rose speaks without words. It teaches through its beauty, its perfume, its perfect geometry. It's a silent teacher that points to truths that transcend rational discourse. When you see a rose mentioned in the scriptures, or carved in a cathedral, or left at the feet of a black Madonna, you're seeing a code. A code that says, here is the door to the interior garden. Enter, bloom, discover the sacred that already lives in you. Now let's dive deeper into the aspect that's perhaps the most fascinating. The rose isn't just a beautiful symbol, it's a map, a guide for the interior spiritual journey. Observe the structure of a rose. The petals organize themselves in spiral, starting from the center and expanding outward. Each layer of petals surrounds the previous one, creating a pattern that mathematicians recognize as a Fibonacci spiral, a mathematical sequence that appears repeatedly in nature. For ancient mystics, this wasn't just a mathematical curiosity. It was evidence that creation followed a divine order, a sacred geometry. And if the rose followed this geometry, then it could serve as a model for the soul's own journey. Think of the rose as a labyrinth in the form of a flower. You begin at the outer petals, the most superficial layer of existence. Here is the world of appearances, of distractions, of common everyday life. Most people live on this outer layer without ever questioning what's beyond. But as you begin to awaken spiritually, you move inward. You cross the next layer of petals. Here you begin to question, to seek, to perceive that there's more to reality than what's obvious. Each layer represents a level of understanding. And as you advance inward, the petals become closer, more intimate, more essential. You go releasing the superficial layers of identity, the social roles, the expectations, the fears, until you reach the center. And at the center of the rose is the heart, the point of union, the place where the human meets the divine, where there's no more separation between you and the sacred, where you realize you always were, yourself, a living temple. This journey isn't linear. Just as the petals of a rose form a spiral, the spiritual journey frequently seems circular. You think you've advanced, and then you discover you're revisiting old questions, but now at a deeper level. The spiral takes you inward, but through movements that seem repetitive, until you realize that each turn brings you closer to the center. The medieval mystics created a symbol based on this understanding, the mystical rose. It was a stylized rose with well-defined layers, and each layer had a name: faith, hope, love, wisdom, grace. Meditating on the mystical rose was a spiritual exercise. You contemplated each layer, understanding what it represented, and gradually moved your consciousness toward the center. This practice wasn't different from Buddhist mandalas or the medieval labyrinths drawn on the floor of some cathedrals. All of these are spiritual maps, tools for the interior journey. And here's something extraordinary. Gothic cathedrals were designed following these same principles. When you enter through a great cathedral, you begin at the narthex, the entrance, then pass through the labyrinth, when there is one, cross the nave, the main body, and finally arrive at the altar, the sacred center. The entire cathedral is a map of the soul's journey, and right above the altar, in many of these cathedrals, is the rose window, the rose of colored light, the focal point. The reminder that the soul's journey is a journey of flowering, of opening, of gradual revelation. Now connect this with the message that the Gnostic texts attribute to Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel of Mary, she teaches about interior visions, about how the soul ascends through different levels of consciousness. She describes the journey as a passage through portals, where at each portal, the soul must release something: attachment, desire, ignorance. It's exactly the same structure as the rose, releasing the outer layers to reach the center. The language may be different, but the map is the same, and this suggests something profound. Certain spiritual truths are universal. They appear in different traditions, using different symbols but pointing to the same interior reality. The rose becomes then a symbol of reconciliation. It honors both the feminine, through its beauty, perfume, and association with goddesses of love, and the masculine, through its perfect geometry and mathematical order. It unites body and spirit, material petals following invisible patterns. It unites the exterior and the interior, visible layers pointing to a hidden center. That's why it was chosen as code by Magdalene and the communities that preserved her teachings. Because the rose says, without words, the journey is inward. The sacred isn't distant. You don't need intermediaries. You are yourself the rose that can bloom, and each time you see a rose, in a garden, in a stained glass window, in a painting, you can remember, this is your journey. You are the rose, and at your deepest center, where no one else can see, there is the sacred waiting to be recognized. But this journey isn't easy. It never was. And those who taught it paid a high price. Now I want to ask you a question. Wherever you are watching this video at this moment, from which city are you listening to me? Write in the comments, because I want to show something. This awakening has no borders. We are thousands, in dozens of countries, rediscovering together a wisdom that was hidden but never destroyed. Put down there, I awaken in your city. Let's make a global map of this movement. Let's show that the rose blooms in all corners of the world. If this symbolic language was so precious, if it contained such profound spiritual teachings, why did it need to be hidden? And who were the people who risked everything to preserve it? History shows us that there has always been tension between institutional spirituality and mystical spirituality. Religious institutions tend to value orthodoxy, hierarchy, control. Mystics value direct experience, personal revelation, interior freedom. And these two forms of religiosity frequently came into conflict. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, it underwent a profound transformation. From a persecuted and decentralized religion, it became a religion of power and structure. Bishops became political figures. Councils defined doctrines. Heresies were declared and punished. In this context, certain teachings became dangerous, especially those that suggested each person could access the divine directly, without need of priests or official sacraments. This was the central message of the Gnostics, and it was for this reason they were declared heretics. But declaring something as heresy doesn't make it disappear. It only pushes it into the shadows. In subsequent centuries, various Christian communities maintained alternative traditions. The Cathars in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries were known for honoring Mary Magdalene in a special way and for allowing women to be spiritual leaders. They believed that the spirit was pure and that the material world was a prison from which the soul should free itself through spiritual knowledge. The Catholic Church saw the Cathars as a grave threat. And in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade, not against Muslims in distant lands, but against Christians in southern France. The Albigensian Crusade resulted in the massacre of tens of thousands of people. Entire cities were destroyed, and the Cathar tradition was almost completely eliminated. Almost, but not totally. There are historical records that some Cathars managed to flee, carrying texts, relics, and transmitting their teachings orally. And curiously, the region of Provence, where the Cathars were strong, is the same region where legends about Mary Magdalene are most alive. The same region of the Black Madonnas, the same region where, to this day, there are pilgrimages to the grotto where Magdalene would have lived. Coincidence or continuity of a tradition that survived persecution? Another fascinating community are the Templars, the order of the Knights of the Temple. Founded in the 12th century to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, the order grew in wealth and power, but it also developed its own spiritual practices. There are academic theories suggesting the Templars had contact with Eastern mystical traditions during the Crusades and that they brought this knowledge to Europe. Gothic cathedrals began to be built exactly at the time when the Templars were at the height of their power. And these cathedrals are full of hidden symbolism, including the rose windows. Scholars of medieval architecture point out that the Templars may have financed or influenced the construction of some of these cathedrals, inserting spiritual codes into them. But in 1307, King Philip IV of France, with the support of Pope Clement V, ordered the arrest of all Templars in France. They were accused of heresy, blasphemy, idol worship. Many were tortured and executed. The order was officially dissolved in 1312. Again, a mystical tradition was crushed by institutional power, but again something survived. Preserved texts, transmitted symbols, knowledge passed from master to disciple in secrecy. What do these stories teach us? That spiritual truth, when lived profoundly, always threatens power structures, because institutional power depends on being the mediator between people and God. But mystical spirituality says, you don't need a mediator. The temple is within you. This message is revolutionary, and that's why it was repeatedly persecuted throughout history. But here's the paradox. The more you try to suppress a truth, the stronger it becomes. The more you burn books, the more precious the ones that survive become. The more you silence voices, the louder they echo through the centuries. The monks who buried the Nag Hammadi manuscripts knew this. The Cathars who orally transmitted their teachings before dying knew this. The cathedral builders who carved roses in stone knew this. They were guardians of a forbidden memory. And thanks to them, today we can read the Gospel of Mary. We can study Gnostic texts. We can look at rose windows and understand the code. These guardians weren't perfect. They weren't infallible saints. They were ordinary people who felt that something precious was being lost and decided to protect it, even if it cost their lives. And today, in a way, all of us are called to be guardians, not of buried texts, but of the spiritual truth that lives in our hearts, not allowing it to be suffocated by rigid dogmas or by superficial skepticism, keeping the flame of authentic seeking lit, honoring the voices that were silenced, preserving the symbolic language that connects generations. The rose reminds us, even when cut, even when trampled, it always grows back. Now we arrive at the document that's at the heart of this story, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This text was discovered at the end of the 19th century in Egypt, but it was only translated and widely published in the 20th century. It's a fragmented manuscript. Pages are missing both at the beginning and in the middle. But what survived is extraordinary. The Gospel of Mary doesn't narrate Jesus' life. It takes place after the resurrection. The disciples are gathered, confused, afraid. Jesus had departed, and they don't know what to do. It's in this context that Magdalene assumes a leadership role. The preserved text shows Magdalene consoling the other disciples. Peter asks her, "Sister, we know the Master loved you differently from other women. Tell us the words he said to you which you remember and which we don't know." And then Magdalene shares teachings that Jesus had given her in private. She describes a spiritual vision, a journey of the soul through different levels or powers that try to prevent it from ascending. At each level, the soul must respond correctly, demonstrating that it understood its true nature. It's a classic Gnostic teaching. The soul doesn't belong to this material world. It descended from celestial realms and is imprisoned in the body. The way back is through knowledge, gnosis. Not intellectual knowledge, but experiential recognition of who you really are. When Magdalene finishes, something revealing happens. Andrew questions, "Say what you think about what she said. I, at least, don't believe the Master spoke like this." And then Peter explodes, "Is it possible that the Master conversed with a woman about secrets he didn't reveal to us? Should we change our customs and all listen to this woman? Did he really choose her and prefer her to us?" It's a moment of dramatic tension. Peter, the rock upon which Jesus supposedly would build his church, questioning Magdalene's authority, not for theological reasons, but because she's a woman. Magdalene cries. And then Levi, another disciple, defends her. "Peter, you've always been impulsive. Now I see you fighting with a woman as if she were an adversary. If the Master considered her worthy, who are you to reject her? Certainly the Master knows her very well. That's why he loved her more than us." The text ends there with this unresolved tension, but what it preserves is crucial, evidence that there was conflict in the first Christian communities about the role of women, evidence that Magdalene had spiritual authority, and evidence that this authority was questioned and eventually erased. Why didn't this text make it into the Bible? The answer is right there, on the very pages of the Gospel, because it presented a woman teaching men. Because it showed conflict and questioning within the circle of disciples, because it suggested there were secret teachings that not all the apostles received, and because it placed Magdalene in a position of spiritual authority that contradicted the patriarchal structure the church was building. But there's something even deeper in this text. The teachings that Magdalene shares aren't about external rules, rituals, or hierarchies. They're about the soul's interior journey, about how true spiritual knowledge comes from within, not from without, about how the soul must recognize its own divine nature to free itself. This is dangerous for any religious institution, because if each person can access the divine directly, through their own interior journey, then what's the institution's role? What's the need for priests as intermediaries? That's why Gnosticism was so strongly combated in the first centuries, not because it was false in itself, but because it threatened the power structure that was being built. And Magdalene, as bearer of these Gnostic teachings, had to be neutralized. They couldn't kill her. She was already dead for centuries when these decisions were made, but they could rewrite her story, transform her from apostle to sinner, from teacher to repentant follower, from leader to silent helper. And for almost 2,000 years this distorted version prevailed, but the texts survived, buried in the sand of Egypt, hidden in jars, waiting for the right moment to resurface. When these manuscripts were discovered in 1945, the world was changing. Women were fighting for rights, for voice, for recognition. And suddenly here was an ancient text that showed this struggle wasn't new, that already in Christianity's first days there were women leaders, and that they were deliberately erased. The Gospel of Mary forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What else was hidden? What other voices were silenced? What other teachings were considered too dangerous? And more important, if we restore these voices, if we read these forgotten texts, how does this change our understanding of Christianity? How does this change our understanding of spirituality? The answer is, it changes profoundly. Because we're no longer limited to a single narrative, we can see the richness, the diversity, the complexity of the movement Jesus initiated. We can see that there was space for women leaders, that there were profound mystical teachings, that there were different ways of understanding the sacred. And when we understand this, when we embrace this plurality, something powerful happens. We realize that authentic spirituality cannot be contained in a single box. It's alive, dynamic, multifaceted, like a rose that has many petals, many shades, many perfumes, but is one single flower. The Gospel of Mary didn't come to destroy faith. It came to expand it, to remind that there were wise, feminine voices from the beginning, and that these voices have something precious to teach even today. When Magdalene cries in the text, facing Peter's accusations, she isn't crying from weakness. She's crying because she knows her voice will be forgotten, that her teachings will be buried, that the symbolic language she developed, the language of the rose, of perfume, of mystical love, will be distorted or lost. But she was wrong about one thing. The voice wasn't completely lost. It echoed through centuries, in hidden manuscripts, in Gothic cathedrals, in popular devotions, in black Madonnas, in roses left on altars. And today, when we read the Gospel of Mary, when we study the Gnostic texts, when we look at the symbols that survived, we're hearing that voice again. We're allowing Magdalene, finally, after 2,000 years, to finish teaching what she began to teach that day, when the disciples were gathered, confused and afraid. And what she teaches is simple but revolutionary. You don't need intermediaries. The divine lives in you. And the spiritual journey is a journey inward, where you discover you always were from the beginning sacred. This is the message of the rose. This is the message of Magdalene. And this is the message they tried to hide, but could never completely destroy. Now we arrive at the heart of everything. Why was this language called the language of love? What does love have to do with roses, gardens, perfumes, and mystical knowledge? To understand this, we need to distinguish between different types of love that the ancients recognized. The Greeks had different words for different types of love: eros, romantic love, desire; philia, fraternal love, friendship; storge, familial love; and agape, divine love, unconditional. When Gnostic and mystical texts speak of love, they're not speaking of sentimentalism or superficial romance. They're speaking of agape, a love that is, actually, a form of knowledge, a love that recognizes the divine in the other, a love that dissolves the separation between you and the sacred. In the Gospel of Philip, another text found at Nag Hammadi, there's an intriguing passage: love builds. He who is in freedom through knowledge is a slave through love for those who have not yet achieved the freedom of knowledge. What does this mean? That true spiritual knowledge, gnosis, doesn't separate you from people. On the contrary, it connects you to them through compassionate love. You don't use your knowledge to feel superior, but to serve, to elevate, to help others awaken. This is the love that Magdalene taught, a love that was at the same time wisdom. And the rose is the perfect symbol for this, because the rose unites beauty, which touches the heart, with perfect geometry, which touches the mind. It unites perfume, which is direct sensory experience, with symbolism, which is conceptual understanding. The rose is complete. It speaks to all levels of the human being. When Magdalene anointed Jesus with perfumed oil, she wasn't just demonstrating affection. She was performing a sacramental act that said, "I recognize who you are. I see the Christ, the Anointed One, in you." It was an act of love, yes, but a love that was pure spiritual recognition. And when the Gospels describe Jesus as loving Magdalene more than the other disciples, we shouldn't necessarily understand this as personal favoritism. We can understand it as recognition of understanding. She grasped the teachings at a level others didn't reach. She saw what he was really teaching, beyond literal words. This is the type of love that the symbolic language of the rose transmits. Love as deep vision, love as recognition, love as union between the one who knows and what is known. The Sufi mystics, centuries later, would use similar language. They would speak of dying before dying, dissolving the ego to unite with the divine beloved. They would use metaphors of gardens, roses, wine, spiritual intoxication, language that sounds romantic but points to profound mystical experiences. Saint Teresa of Avila in the 16th century would describe her mystical experiences using language of passionate love, the soul as bride, Christ as groom, spiritual union as mystical marriage. The Church allowed this language because Teresa was a respected nun, but the language was the same that the Gnostics used, the same that Magdalene used, the language of love as spiritual path. Why does this language work? Because love is the only force that can dissolve boundaries. Love knows no separation. When you love deeply, you forget yourself, you exit your ego, and in that moment of self-forgetting, something greater can be experienced. The teachings that use the language of love aren't saying have loving feelings. They're saying dissolve the illusion of separation through profound recognition of the sacred in everything. The rose teaches this silently. Each petal is unique, but all are part of the same flower. Each person is unique, but all are part of the same divine creation. Separation is illusion, unity is truth. And when you understand this, not intellectually but experientially, you're living in the language of love. You're reading the code of the rose. This was the secret teaching. Not secret because it was selfishly guarded, but secret because it cannot be transmitted only in words. It needs to be lived. It needs to be experienced. That's why Jesus spoke in parables. That's why Magdalene used symbols. That's why mystical communities developed rituals, gestures, perfumes, ways to transmit experience, not just information. The rose, offered in silence, says more than 1,000 sermons. The perfume that fills the environment speaks directly to the heart, without passing through the analytical mind. The colored light crossing a cathedral's rose window creates an experience of transcendent beauty that no doctrine can capture. This is the language of love. And this is the language that Magdalene wanted to leave to the world. It's not a language that excludes. It's a language that includes. You don't need to be a theologian to understand a rose. You don't need to be literate to feel a perfume. You don't need to be rich to see light through petals. It's a democratic language, a language of the heart, a language that says, the sacred isn't distant, isn't guarded in inaccessible temples, isn't reserved for specialists. The sacred is here, now, in a blooming rose, in a perfume that reminds you of something you didn't know you had forgotten, in a moment of profound recognition when you look at another person and see, really see, the light that lives in them. This is the language they tried to hide. Because if everyone could read this language, if everyone could access the sacred directly, then religious power structures would lose their purpose. But the rose continued blooming. And today, when you see one, you can remember, you're looking at an ancient code, a code that says you are loved, not because you deserve it, not because you're perfect, but because love is your essential nature. You are, at your deepest core, made of love. You are an expression of the divine. You are yourself a rose in the garden of creation. And when you understand this, when you live from this recognition, you're speaking the language that Magdalene taught, the secret language of love. So what do we do with all this? What do we do with ancient manuscripts, forgotten symbols, silenced voices, and secret languages? The answer is simple. We bring them back to life, not as museum artifacts, not as historical curiosities, but as living wisdom that still has something to teach us today. You don't need to be Christian to benefit from these teachings. You don't need to literally believe every word of the Apocryphal Gospels. What you need is to be open to the possibility that there are layers of reality beyond what's obvious, that there's depth waiting to be discovered, that there's ancient wisdom that's still relevant. The language of the rose teaches us about interior journey, about gradual blooming, about having courage to release the superficial layers to reach the true center. This is relevant in 2025 as much as it was in 325 AD. The story of Mary Magdalene teaches us about silenced voices and how they eventually resurface. It teaches us that spiritual authority doesn't depend on gender, social position, or institutional approval. It teaches us that profound recognition, the type of knowledge she had, is more valuable than merely intellectual knowledge. The communities that preserved these teachings, even under persecution, teach us about courage, about keeping the flame of truth lit, even when it's dangerous, about protecting what's precious so future generations can benefit. And the symbols that survived, the rose windows, the black Madonnas, the roses on altars, teach us that truth always finds a way. It can be distorted, reinterpreted, hidden, but it doesn't die. It waits. And at the right moment, it blooms again. We're living this moment of blooming now. Texts are being translated. Research is being done. People around the world are questioning official narratives and seeking deeper layers of meaning. This isn't accident. It's part of a collective awakening. A recognition that we were taught simplified versions of complex stories, and that when we recover the complexity, when we honor the plurality, when we listen to the voices that were silenced, we become more complete. You, watching this video, are part of this. You felt something resonate when you heard about the rose, about Magdalene, about the secret language of love. This resonance isn't accidental, it's recognition. It's something in you that always knew there was more, and that's now finding confirmation. Trust that. Explore that. Read the texts that were hidden. Look at symbols with new eyes. Enter an ancient cathedral and see the rose windows not as decoration, but as spiritual code. Hold a rose and remember that you too are on a journey of blooming, and share this. Because just as ancient communities preserved these teachings by passing them forward, we too are called to share. Not in a proselytizing way, not trying to convince anyone, but simply living from this profound recognition, being ourselves examples that the interior journey is possible. That spiritual awakening isn't the privilege of few, but the potential of all. The rose that Magdalene wanted to leave to the world hasn't withered. It's blooming now, in you, in me, in all who choose to make the interior journey, all who choose to listen to the silenced voices, all who choose to read the forgotten codes. This is the true legacy. It's not in ancient texts locked in museums, it's alive in us when we choose to live consciously, when we choose to love deeply, when we choose to recognize the sacred in ourselves, in others, in life itself. The secret language of love that Magdalene taught isn't secret because it was hidden. It's secret because it can only be understood by those who live it, by those who love, by those who bloom. And you, who watched until here, have already begun to bloom, have already begun to understand the language, have already begun to read the code of the rose. Continue. The journey is just beginning, and at the center, where all the petals meet, where the human touches the divine, there you are. You always were, waiting to be recognized, waiting to bloom. If you made it this far on this journey, then you're part of this collective awakening. Subscribe to the channel now, because each video we publish is one more piece of this millennial puzzle, one more layer of revelation, one more way to unveil the codes that were hidden but are now resurfacing. Activate the bell, because you won't want to miss what comes next. And now click on the next video that appears on your screen, because the journey of discovery continues, and there's much more to unveil about the hidden truths that shaped Christianity and Western spirituality. The rose awaits you. Continue blooming with us. Thank you for watching until the end, until the next video.